Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are watching today. Welcome to the final session of the 2021 Humanitarian Leadership Conference. My name is Peter Walton, and I am the CEO of CARE Australia and also the moderator for this final session. I am dialing in from Melbourne, Australia, so let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded. I hope you have all found the conference as invigorating, as inspiring, as provocative, and indeed at times as constructively discomforting as I have. I think it has been a truly wonderful event. And we have been talking before about remarking just how in many ways liberating and democratizing it is to have people from so many countries be able to participate in such important dialogue. This conference and its theme, Who Are the Humanitarians, aim to challenge traditional humanitarian systems, traditional actors, and indeed embedded perceptions. At its core were four sub-themes: the political economy of aid and solidarity, leadership in a world of great upheaval and crisis, transformative ways of working, and finally, decolonizing the humanitarian ecosystem. So this final session will draw many of these themes together, exploring what I and many would argue is a true moment of reckoning. But it is very easy to identify flaws in what exists. It is very easy to say what isn't working. And whilst we can envisage different futures, overcoming the power of the status quo is incredibly difficult. So tonight we will be exploring, or today, depending on where you're calling from, we will be exploring these themes, and we have a truly incredible lineup of speakers and panelists. But before we get to that, however, I would like to introduce Dr. Admirable Nakubay. Admiral is a humanitarian professional from Zimbabwe. His experience is in resource development, program management, and partnerships with several INGOs and the UN in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Africa. He's currently based in Botswana and loves poetry and music, and many of you may know his work. His poetry challenges practices within the sector, and tonight he will recite his poem, Where Are the People? A beautiful poem that focuses on reconceptualizing the role of affected populations in humanitarian response. A very warm welcome, Admiral. Over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are located. I believe this poem will neatly sum up what we've been talking about over the past 2 days. It reminds us exactly on why we are here and what matters the most. So let me share my screen. Yep, all right. Where are the people? Here we go. Long ago, a vocation they called it, and it was clear. It was compassion for the people that made it so dear. Where there was need, hearts moved to act. For against all odds, hopes turned to fact. Humane it was, and people really did matter. But times have changed, though needs have grown. In place of a vocation, an industry has been sown, driven by gain, we've lost the plot. Led by experts, we've built a sport. You may call it, but where are the people? Listen to us here with a sense of superiority, a superiority that reduces a people to projects that demean a people to mere beneficiaries whose ways are replaced with the foreign. Humane we brag, but where are the people? What shall we say then when the humane is lost? When a people's ordeal is reduced to a log frame? When their lives are the subject of a pilot study? When servers intrude their privacy and dignity? When stories of desperation are used for marketing? When images of children are patented and sold? When their life is explained by indicators and theories? When a people's suffering means a career for some? When donations are raised but never disclosed? humane, we conclude. But where are the people? The time should be now for people who reside in poverty and in conflict to be made to decide what they need. And if ever they need it, what kind of assistance from those so distant? To hear them speak is the challenge of the hour. That at the heart of a crisis is a people with a life. To treat them like so matters the most. Systems and processes have their place, but the people who we serve deserve a space. Again, I ask, where are the people? And are we really listening? Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Admiral. I think it's a poem that really helps to set the scene. It's a poem that helps to set the context of so much of our debate, and I hope something that sets the tone for our discussion tonight. So let's move. Thank you very much. I think that's just truly wonderful, but also a challenge and possibly a roadmap for us to consider as we go into this discussion. So let me move to the next section. Prior to the COVID pandemic, I think we could all agree that the global in-tray was already pretty full. Before 2020, and what was, a challenging year for the whole globe, it was estimated that there was a 40% shortfall in financing to meet the humanitarian challenges of the day. Of course, there were 1.3 billion people still living under the poverty line. So in recent decades, arguably less poverty, but certainly more inequality. We were and we are seeing the increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters. We're seeing foreign aid declining in many areas and populism clearly on the rise. The list goes on, and if we fast forward 10 years or so, we'll have 1 billion more people on the planet. We'll have a planet that's 1.5 degrees warmer with all of the consequences that brings. There may be as many as 100 million people on the move fleeing conflict or crisis. So where does that leave us? Is this really a moment of reckoning? Will the Black Lives Matters movement, the calls to address the sector's systemic racism, or the simple forecasts of what we may face in the coming years, will these conflate to be the burning platform for urgent change? And if so, what will take its place? Our keynote speaker today will talk about the future of aid, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Heba Aly. She is a multimedia journalist by training, and she spent a decade reporting from conflict zones in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia before moving into management. Her work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Christian Science Monitor, Bloomberg News, and the New Humanitarian, among others, took her to places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Chad, and Libya. And she received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for her work in Northern Sudan. She has worked with the New Humanitarian since 2007, and she is a champion of responsible journalism from crisis zones. If you haven't watched her recent TEDx talk, Stop Eating Junk News, then I'll encourage you to do so. A very, very warm welcome to you, Heba Aly.
Thank you very much, Peter, and it's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations to all those of you who are still here after 48 hours of a quite intense program. And Arbie this morning inspired me to wear, when he put on his Filipino shirt, my Egyptian shirt. So here I am, and Ramadan Kareem to all those of you who are fasting. The humanitarian sector, for all of its faults, I think is very good at pointing out its failings. Conference after conference, I hear people pointing to the ills in the sector. And of course, at the New Humanitarian, we do our fair share of that as well. What I hear less of is what the alternative looks like. In order to change something, I think you need to know what you're working towards. And when you write a strategy, you describe the vision of what you'd like to get to, and only then can you develop a strategy for how you're going to get there. So what I'd like to do today is make a small contribution to articulating what the goal is. And a disclaimer, of course, I'm a journalist. I am not an academic. I am not a humanitarian. And frankly, I don't have a stake in this game. So these are the views of a humble observer who watches the sector from a distance, speaks to a range of different people from very different vantage points, and has something of the luxury to be able to try to connect the dots. I hope you can hear the birds outside. If they start to become problematic, let me know and I'll close the window. The New Humanitarian, formerly Era News, as many of you will know, has been reporting on humanitarian crises since the Rwandan genocide in 1995. Last year, we marked our 25th anniversary. And it was just the time, we thought, to look back on the world's response to crises over the last quarter century and ask whether aid had delivered on its promises and what lessons could be learned for the future. So we called this series Rethinking Humanitarianism, and we set out to explore the past, present, and future of crisis response. Then, of course, a global pandemic hit and dramatically challenged the way aid was being delivered, from the funding models hard hit by a global recession to international aid operations severely disrupted by travel restrictions and procurement challenges. Of course, if that wasn't enough, a resurgent Black Lives Matter movement led to another moment of reckoning in the sector, as Peter just mentioned. And I think what I have seen is humanitarians beginning to ask a few pretty critical questions. To what extent are humanitarians equipped to deal with the kinds of deeply rooted injustices that we have seen over the past year? Is it even the role of humanitarians to relieve suffering in the so-called global north? Does racism exist within the humanitarian sector itself? And perhaps more fundamentally, to what extent is the sector part of or propping up a world order that for many is designed to keep power and resources concentrated in the hands of certain people and countries and keep other people and countries poor and powerless? So suddenly our project of rethinking humanitarianism became quite an urgent priority, as you might imagine. And looking back on what has become 6 months of commentary and analysis, hosting conversations, interviewing people on our new Rethinking Humanitarianism podcast, this is, I think, what we've seen. The world's response to crisis has evolved significantly in the last 25 years. The field has professionalized, it has become more coordinated. There are standards and trainings. Aid workers don't hop on the back of trucks with rebels anymore. And yet in other ways, crisis response hasn't changed at all. It remains predominantly Western dominated in its orientation, charity driven in its business model, and technocratic in its approach. Perhaps most importantly for me, and this is the crux of it, it may no longer be the right solution to the problems the world faces today. Yes, humanitarians are saving lives, but suffering continues around the world at a level of magnitude that seems disproportionate to all the time, money, and effort that goes into emergency aid. And if the scale of the need today continues growing as it has, humanitarianism in its current form is never going to be enough. And so if the goal of the humanitarian endeavor is to alleviate human suffering, are there in the modern era more effective ways of focusing that energy? Through the course of the Rethinking Humanitarianism series, here are the conclusions I've come to, and the title of the talk kind of gives it away. I think today's humanitarianism is reaching its limits, and some, including my co-host or former co-host on the podcast, Jeremy Kanundijk, will rightly question that premise. And we certainly have been saying this is the end of aid for decades, and meanwhile the sector just keeps growing. But consider these 4 areas where I think the sector is starting to show signs of its limitations. And I'm just going to share my screen because some of this will be easier to see visually. Financially, I'm going to take these in turn. While the percentage of needs met by traditional funding remains steady, so far around 60%, according to the UN, we're seeing some signs of a plateauing in available humanitarian funding. And you can see that particularly on the graph on the right, which shows funding for the ICRC seemingly coming to a plateau. And this is before any talk of the impact of COVID on aid business models, which, as we all know, has been a real concern for many. Operationally, there are many reasons I think operationally the humanitarian system has reached its limits, but I'll focus on 3. COVID has exposed the limits of a model that depends on parachuting people into a crisis. And as one aid worker in Colombia told me, no parachute will be big enough when you have crises everywhere, when the whole world is hit at once, as was the case with COVID, and will be even more the case, as Peter mentioned in his introduction, when the full effects of climate change begin to hit. Secondly, I think humanitarian aid is by definition a band-aid solution that only makes sense when crises are temporary. And now that crises are lasting on average 6 to 8 years, sometimes decades, it's just not operationally efficient to be giving people short-term aid year after year. And finally, governments are reclaiming their sovereignty. Many are no longer willing to welcome aid on their territory. And I'm not just talking about the Somalias and the Syrias of the world, but take Indonesia, which, as you know, in the wake of the Sulawesi tsunami, said to foreign aid workers, no, thank you, we don't want you. So operationally, I think we're seeing some limits. Structurally, at the macro level, humanitarian aid is based on a multilateral system, and the threats we face today are largely transnational in nature. Antonio Donini, a humanitarian and academic, recently wrote, "The major challenges humanity faces today, the climate crisis, unregulated financial capitalism, growing inequality within and among societies, international crime, the arms trade, acts of terror, the inhumanity of protracted warfare, the rise of surveillance states, the abuse and weaponization of the commons, of course, pandemics. These are all transnational threats at their core, and multilateralism as a tool was not conceived to deal with them." Finally, and I won't spend too much time on this, even though it is the most important to my mind, but I think we're all well aware of the ethical limits of today's humanitarianism. I submitted evidence in 2016 to a UK parliamentary committee looking into humanitarian system reform, and I argued that the aid sector had become this mammoth machinery that had in many ways lost track of what it stands for. And we see this playing out in many ways, in the competition within the sector, in the lack of participation and agency for whom the sector is meant to serve, conflicts of interest, misaligned incentive structures, a lack of accountability for fraud, sexual abuse, misconduct. When I look at the financial flows in the sector, I think it's another sign of how the sector is reaching its ethical limits, in that it operates like an oligarchy with a set of institutions that control most of the money. And if the humanitarian sector were a country, it would be the most unequal in the world. This comes from some data visualizations we did years back called the humanitarian economy. Of course, we've reported on plenty of examples of white supremacy and neocolonialism in aid, from aid flows that really map soft power relationships between former colonial powers and former colonies to outright discrimination against people of color within aid organizations. So financially, operationally, structurally, and ethically, I think there is an argument to be made that the sector has reached its limits. And consider some of these comments from some leaders in this sector. I don't think the traditional aid industry has a future. This model of governments giving money to the Red Cross because it's good will not last another decade. The humanitarian system will be far from what we had in the past. I'm convinced there is no way of going back. And so you can always argue that the future will look a lot like the present, but that's often due to a lack of imagination. So what I'd like to suggest we do now is start imagining. If you were taking a blank slate and the goal of humanitarianism was to alleviate suffering, what would be the best way to do so in the 21st century? And I really don't think that mattresses, hygiene kits, and tarpaulin delivered by the rich to the poor year after year would be the answer. I've listened to a lot of the talks over the last few days. We heard Danny Sriskandarajah talking about mutual liberation or mutuality as a key lens through which to see the new humanitarianism he described during the opening plenary. I heard Susan Sibatindira talking about designing aid interventions as a repair to the neo-colonial structures they were born of. I heard Wakanye Hoffman talking about reframing innovation as collective efforts to problem solving. Arbie Baguios, who encouraged humanitarians to tremble in their ignorance and enjoy the pluriverse. And Lina Attar questioning whether neutrality stands in opposition to humanity. I noted a few of the questions that came up from participants over the course of these past couple of days. Someone asked, when will INGOs be explicitly anti-war? Someone else said, what can we do better to tackle the root cause of poverty, which stems from donor countries' economic policies? So even from those few little bits and pieces, you can start to see a vision emerging. And I'd like to try to pull some of those strings together. So here's how I would summarize that vision. Again, drawing on several months of this Rethinking Humanitarianism series, where we'd really tried to create a forum for exchange, debate, and discussion about the future of aid. And I think the first pillar of this emerging vision is moving from local communities getting a piece of the pie to local communities making the pie. And this is a quote from Muthoni Wanyeki, a Kenyan activist who leads the Open Society Foundation's Africa program. And she submitted a piece for our Future of Aid series in which she described a new kind of world order in which Africans build their own future rather than waiting for a multilateral system that is broken to help them. She refers to examples of humanitarianism at play within Africa, the individuals who set up cash transfer programs for fellow citizens during COVID, the Adopt a Family initiatives, the neighborhood collections, the cheap testing and vaccine research under the African Research University Alliances, PPE that was made from self-help groups, et cetera, et cetera. And really a model in which young, bright Africans were helping themselves. And she saw this as humanitarianism's future. That's one key pillar. I think another pillar that is emerging in the new vision of humanitarianism is moving from colonial to empowering. We've heard a lot about a new role for the UN and for international NGOs that would move from operational delivery to technical guidance, to fundraising, to advocacy. In other words, where the international architecture becomes, its key role becomes enabling others. And as Lena said in her keynote this morning, if leadership is seeing the potential in people and having the courage to develop that potential, I see no greater sign of leadership in the humanitarian sector than to support the development of local humanitarianism around the world. This certainly signals a new role for international NGOs in particular, and I think it's one we're starting to see signs of in practice already. This is a quote from Dajani, actually, from several years back, but it has stayed with me for a really long time because I find it so powerful in signaling what I think is the third pillar of an emerging vision for humanitarianism, and that is moving from neutrality to solidarity. If you consider, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the suffering in the world today, is rice and tarpaulin really the answer? Or is it social justice, equal access to healthcare and opportunity? And so again, if humanitarianism is aimed at alleviating suffering, what is the cause of most of the suffering today? And I think increasingly humanitarians are recognizing that social justice is at the heart of their mandate. And that's very uncomfortable for some, as we've heard over the course of these last couple of days. But I think it's an area in which we're starting to see a growing, I won't say consensus, but more and more voices arguing that neutrality should not necessarily be a pillar of humanitarianism. Hugo Slim wrote a piece for us a few months ago that described humanitarians over the course of history who didn't hesitate to take sides and to defend what they felt was the marginalized, to speak out in the face of injustice. He mentioned a British nurse who smuggled out Allied soldiers in World War I, medics who treated protesters during the Arab Spring, who clearly had a stake and a side in the crisis or the conflict, but that didn't stop them from being humanitarians. And so this quote from Dajani really brings that point home for me. Before annual reports and pay scales and business plans and bureaucratic processes, we were passionate, inspired volunteer activists who were connecting and empowering and talking about things like solidarity. And that's where our pulsing heart was. And I think this model of humanitarianism as activism, as mutual aid, as solidarity is certainly emerging as part of what the future humanitarianism looks like. The fourth pillar I would describe as moving from centrality to humility. And Arbie mentioned this a bit this morning as well, but if you look at the plethora of players that are involved in responding to humanitarian crises, we all know that it goes well beyond the humanitarian sector. You have local communities who know best what they need. You've got municipalities who have local infrastructure that they can draw off. You have the diaspora that has much greater access at times citizen volunteers who bring authenticity and a networked approach, faith-based organizations, non-traditional actors, development actors who bring way more money than the humanitarian sector ever could, and the private sector that brings its technical know-how. And if you look at the COVID crisis in particular, as Christina Bennett of the START Network mentioned to me early on in the pandemic, this is a humanitarian crisis that doesn't have a humanitarian solution. And as she put it, humanitarian solutions represent a sliver of what the world needs right now, and is really a big player in all of this. And so one part of the humanitarianism of the future, I think, is shrinking the scope of the humanitarian aid sector. And finally, this is something we've talked about for years, but there is certainly a massive and growing imperative to move from reaction to anticipation and prevention. And yes, many will argue it's not the role of humanitarians to do development. But if you are saving someone today, just to end up putting them in the same vulnerability tomorrow, have you achieved your mission of alleviating suffering? And this is a quote from the German government, who has been pushing anticipatory action and anticipatory financing as a new way forward, that if you know a disaster is going to strike, it is immoral to wait until it happens before you do something. And so together, for me, what I'm trying to piece together from all of those op-eds and podcast episodes and commentaries is a humanitarianism in which affected people are making the pie, in which international interventions are in support of those local actions, in which activism and solidarity are not only acceptable but encouraged, in which formal humanitarian sector networks play off of other capabilities in the world, and in which the focus is on preventing rather than reacting. And that starts to paint a picture for me of what effective humanitarianism of the future may look like. And part of that may evolve from the sector that exists today. Part of it may have nothing to do with that sector at all. So what does that look like in practice? Well, I think there are a lot of examples of this already happening. If you look at YMCA Jerusalem, which submitted a description for our Future of Aid series of a project in which communities were budgeting their own projects. In northeastern Myanmar, a group of Kachin organizations came together for a large EU grant and decided they would refuse to partner with any international NGO as an implementing partner, and thereby made it impossible for those international NGOs to submit a credible proposal. And instead, they collectively selected an international NGO to submit a proposal that they had put together. In other words, they became the ones subcontracting the international NGO instead of vice versa. We heard on our podcast from Sema Genel about a locally run collaboration and funding platform in the response to the earthquake in Izmir in Turkey. We heard from Paul Curian about networked humanitarianism at play in the response to the influx of migrants and asylum seekers in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's very easy, I think, to talk about these changes as something that feels really abstract and really lofty, but in fact, we're seeing examples of them on a day-to-day basis. Is the aid model dead? Maybe, maybe not. Are there emerging visions for an alternative? Certainly yes, from what we've seen. Will the sector get there? That, I think, is up to you. We will continue to provide at the New Humanitarian a forum for exchange of ideas on this, and my colleague will drop into the chat some links where you can subscribe to our news, where you can become a member, or where you can indicate interest in taking part in some future conversations on this topic. We do hope to be convening policymakers and donors with racial justice activists and local communities to try to have a really frank conversation about what it would take to overcome some of the obstacles to decolonization moving forward. And so we will continue to try to foster that kind of debate. But as I say, I think the vision exists, and it's just a matter of developing the strategy to get there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Heba. That's terrific. I did find myself nodding furiously through so much of what you're putting forward. But as a CEO of an INGO here in Australia, that is trying to push many of the things that you are calling for, I can attest that it's hard. So, the vision for where we need to go, I think is really important. But how do we get from where we're at to where we need to go to is going to be the focus of our panel discussion tonight. So let me move on. We have 4 incredible panelists joining us for a discussion. Most have been involved in other parts of the conference, and most may be well known to many of you, but let me briefly welcome and introduce them all to you now. First, I'd like to welcome Degan Aly. Degan is the Executive Director of Adeso and co-founder of the NEAR Network. She has more than 20 years of hands-on experience in the humanitarian and development field. Is a strong believer and a passionate campaigner for transforming the current aid system to give more power and voice to local communities and civil society organizations. As a true innovator, you will often hear her leading many new solutions to build the infrastructure that will truly shift power and resources. Welcome, Degan. Secondly, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker from day one, Dani Sriskandarajah. Dani is CEO of Oxfam, Great Britain, and prior to joining Oxfam in 2019, he was Secretary General of Civicus, the Global Civil Society Alliance, and before that, Director General of the Royal Commonwealth Society. He is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Global Public Goods in the Fourth Industrial Revolution and has been a member on UN high-level panels, both for digital cooperation and indeed for humanitarian financing. Welcome back, Dani. Next, may I introduce Arbie Baguios. Arbie, also probably very well known to many of you, is a humanitarian and development professional and founder of a website that I greatly enjoy, Aid Reimagined, an initiative that helps to usher the evolution of aid towards effectiveness and justice through an interdisciplinary lens. He is also a fellow at IRAN, the Interagency Research and Analysis Network, which is a collaborative hub of humanitarian professionals. Arbie's worked with ActionAid, Save the Children, Red Cross and UNICEF. He's originally from the Philippines, but I think currently based in London and a graduate of the London School of Economics. So a warm welcome to you, Arbie. And finally, again, many of you may know Mary Anna Macklassen. Mary Anna joined as the lead of the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership in June 2020, and she holds dual master's degrees in public policy and nursing from Princeton University and the University of Washington. She comes to the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership with almost 20 years of experience as a family nurse practitioner and has a decade of field-based roles in the humanitarian space across programs in Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East. So a warm welcome to all of the panelists today. So I think Heba has set the scene. There's a vision for the future, but I think we all know that if it was so easy to change, frankly, we would have done a lot of changing already. So I've got a range of questions for each of you, and I'm also getting lots of questions from those dialing in the audience tonight. And just for those people in the audience, I will try to weave as many of the questions as I can. But I think we may have some time constraints, but I'll do my very best. So let me kickstart things. Arguably, it is not enough to simply challenge an old narrative, however outdated and discredited that may be, as Heba has said. You really need the compelling reasons for change to be understood and the barriers to be overcome. I often remark that the department of the status quo is often the most powerful. So firstly, Degan, are the moral reasons or the ethical reasons for change really enough? Does it matter if change is driven by other non-altruistic forces? What's it really going to take, Degan?
I think there has to be a level of altruism and ethics involved. But I also think that practically, it also has to be about business sense. And is this viable anymore? Can we exist in this way that we are as INGOs? I think the UN will exist, sadly, because they serve a purpose for donors. But I'm just not sure if the structure as it is, I like Heba, I'm not convinced that it can survive all the changes that have occurred. And as I see more and more global South governments exert their sovereignty, I actually think that that will happen, not just what has happened in Asia. I always look up to Asia as our role model, and we in Africa and the Middle East need to follow that path of sovereignty. And I actually think that when we talk about shrinking civil society space, what happens with many governments is that in an effort to exert sovereignty and independence from external foreign actors, they clump all civil society organizations together. So they see you as a local NGO taking money from INGOs from the UN system as part and parcel of the system. And this, I think, is one of the reasons that there has been this tension between civil society and national governments, because they see us as an arm of these external actors and not as really working for the interest of our people. Sometimes, obviously, they're wrong, but it's also wrong the fact that internationals have been talking about developing capacity, but at the same time, they have never invested in resilient civil societies that can push back against their own governments. You know, when we had a problem with deregistration in Kenya of hundreds of Kenyan NGOs, not one INGO stood in solidarity with us, not one. They were all interested publicly. We were the only ones because they were all interested in preserving their existence and their registration status and their ability to operate in Kenya. So there has to be recognition that you're kind of fueling the fire. You talk about shrinking civic space, but you're actually contributing to that by participating in this game. So I actually think that if they want to exist, they have to change their business model, because the status quo is not, in my opinion, viable.
Thanks, Degan. So the role of INGOs and perpetuating the current system or not, conscious bias or unconscious bias. Dani, as a CEO of an INGO, we know the measures of success in the sector have become often about money, about growth, about size, rather than impact. So for power to shift, surely it really does mean operating models of INGOs changing. To shift power ultimately means somebody giving up something. So what do you think it will take for this to be viewed differently by boards of INGOs, when the measures of success are, win more grants than the INGO down the road?
Yeah, look, thank you. And it's been a fascinating conversation over these last 48 hours. And I think ending where Heba ends, and your question, Peter, is exactly the right thing to do, which is saying, well, what next? What does this system look like in 5 or 10 years? And to your point, Peter, I think for those of us who have the privilege of working within the system, particularly those of us, who get paid a salary to work within some bit of our sort of ecosystem, I think we have to sort of face up to our responsibility to push hard for the sort of necessary evolutions that we've been talking about. So from an INGO point of view, when I talk to my trustees, the point I often make is, look, there is this need out there. We need to play a role in delivering where we can, if you want it to, but it's the sort of, we have to be equally attentive of the change we need to be part of, the sort of what and how that I was trying to get across earlier, that, we need to be there providing safe, high quality, partner-led interventions, but we also need to be conscious of the power and resources that we hold. And so long-term success is not necessarily writing ourselves out of the picture, because I do think there's a role for global networks, of civic networks that build from below, but also beyond borders. But we need to be far more conscious of the power we hold and shift that. But just on closing, I think it's really important for those of us who are, within the system, if you will, to push for evolution. But we should also not kid ourselves that that's going to be enough, because I think, as Degan and others have said sort of very powerfully, that we need a revolution as well, right? And some of this has to be about others taking power. Some of this about building a new economy, in the way that Heba put it, that probably is going to start local. It's almost certainly going to have a very different mix of actors, and it almost certainly will have a different set of financial sort of flows. And we may or may not be part of that new solution, but in some ways you need both strategies, and those from within need to push as hard for evolution and nurture and support others who are challenging the system and building new systems and new models as well. Thanks.
So, Arbie, Do you think INGOs are genuinely ready to seek power? You had a great blog that argued that aid may be inherently racist, but altruism is not, and that's cause for hope. So how do we translate that hope into tangible change? And are INGOs willing to join that shift?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for your question. And I really agree with a lot of the points that have been made so far, especially with Heba's point about, trying to sort of like change the economy, right? And trying to sort of like zoom out. First, I'd like to kind of like react to that, right? And we're talking about, aid is not going to be the same in the future. Everything, a lot of the problems in society is caused by injustice. So social justice, right? And we have to build resilience, etc. And I think that's really interesting, because then we should be then the solution sector. We shouldn't be the aid sector. We should be the solution sector. And if we're tackling injustice and all these sort of like bigger things, we shouldn't, we should be on a WhatsApp group with the human rights sector and the lawyers and the science sector and the engineering sector. And I think we're so, we're so focused on our own little corner that, I agree with the analysis that it is about social justice. Then what are we doing here in this very insular corner of the world, right? We should expand. We should be the solution sector. And I say that to answer the question about hope, because I do believe that there is a role for global solidarity and global network. And I think that it can look like this in the future. It can look like actually genuine cooperation across sectors, across different industries, global north to global south, grassroots, and big bureaucracies. And I think that's, however the specific details are, I'm not sure, but I think there is really that trajectory.
Thank you, Arbie. So Mariana, you run the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. So I have a question about leadership here. So throughout this conference, and I've loved so many of the panels, the words system, ecosystem, systems changed. In fact, if I had a pound for every time that they were said, I think I could increase foreign aid. But an ecosystem is an interaction of many moving and competing parts and objectives. So from a leadership perspective, what's the tipping point for systems change? Because I reflect in my own role, we are a bit player. We can try to influence, but if we open up a void that someone else just fills with the same old, that's not change. So what's the leadership tipping point? What is needed?
I think that's, number one, a huge question. And really, it's the question we're trying to answer here. At our conference 2 years ago, way before my time, I think that's when Degan coined the first phrase, "A reckoning is coming." It's changing whether or not INGOs want it to change. The world has changed. And that was really prescient. That was before COVID. That was before the Black Lives Matter movement has taken its second swell. So I think the tipping point has already begun. And I think this conference is trying to capitalize on that and make sure that we capture that momentum. And this doesn't become a moment, but it actually does become a movement. That's kind of terrifying in one way, because there have been so many efforts to reform parts of the sector. But at CHL, we specifically use the term system to drill into exactly what you said, and really playing off of what Arbie said, that we really do envision a diverse humanitarianism that includes all of these different sectors coming together. And Arbie, I'm just going to steal this forever, that we do need to be the solution sector. I think that's brilliant. Why are we the aid sector? Why do we, I think, coming along and fixing the same problem over and over again, and just dovetailing on what Heba said in her talk? Why do we deliver mattresses year after year? Why do we replace the same plastic sheeting and the same tents year after year, and there's no political solution for crisis? So I think leadership means sitting in this really uncomfortable space. We opened the conference with sort of my two favorite values of courage and humility. We have to deal with these problems bravely. We have to sit in the sticky, uncomfortable, awkward conversations. We have to enter rooms intentionally to have these conversations. When we see there's a gap, we have to grab as Arbie said, grab the lawyers, grab the journalists. Thank you for being here, Heba, because we need the other perspective, because the echo chamber isn't serving any of us, and there's no leadership in an echo chamber. So from our side, I think leadership really is just living in the gray and finding solutions. And I think if anyone's out there tweeting, we need to amplify this whole idea of being a solution sector, because I think that we need other humanitarians. And by the way, humanitarians are not just humanitarians. Let's bring our development colleagues along the way. Let's bring our peace building colleagues along the way. Let's redefine what humanitarianism is, rather than these two distinct, we have our developments and we have our humanitarians, and then there's something in the middle that we call the nexus sometimes, or we call the transition, or we call stabilization, but that's not how life works. So I agree with what Arbie said, is let's bring everyone to the table. Let's have the messy conversations, and let's be willing to lose something. And really circling back to the beginning, is the moral imperative enough? I wish it was. The idealist in me wishes that we were all led by morals and ethics, and that will of course play a role. But frankly speaking, there are a lot of other levers out there in the ecosystem. A lot of them are not very savory, but we have to look at that entire political economy, and we have to be able to speak to all of those spaces.
Great, thank you. A pivotal moment for me was in a former role where I commissioned some research looking at what the locally led humanitarian system looked like in the Pacific, using local researchers and local methodologies. And they did conclude that if you're serious about locally led, you have to start by changing yourself. And in that organization, we went on a journey, which I'm very proud of. But one quote resonated with me from a Pacific Islander who said, at times of disaster, what we need is a locally made canoe, but you send in a battleship. And I think it has always stuck with me. But we are just, one part of the puzzle. So Heba, in many countries, the support for aid has been in decline for many, many years. And in many places, I think COVID has reinforced that the aid starts at home narrative. What do you think is the role of journalism and media in terms of, carving out that complementarity that is really going to help solve some of the transnational issues that you've identified?
I think journalism is increasingly about telling transnational stories. So what our task is, our task is changing, and we have our own discussion internally about what does it mean to decolonize our journalism. And I can talk about that very briefly, but before, let me answer your question. I think that part of our role is creating an understanding among global audiences that the challenges that people face are quite similar. And at the end of the day, the woman in a refugee camp who wants to feed her children has pretty similar motivations than someone in the United States or in Europe. And so helping people understand that the universality of the experience that they're having, I think is part of our task. And that doesn't necessarily change the fact that people will want to help themselves before they help others, but I think it will go some way to the othering that tends to take place in terms of seeing people experiencing crisis elsewhere as something very foreign. And COVID, I think, has also helped with that, in the sense that to greater or lesser degrees, everyone has now experienced what it means to be in a crisis. And we hope that that's an opening to be able to say, okay, well, now you understand why it's so important that the world responds to crises effectively. And there are a whole bunch of other crises out there that maybe you should also be paying attention to. Maybe just a quick point on decolonizing journalism, because I say part of our role is creating that empathy among global audiences, but also part of our role is ensuring that our journalism serves those local audiences. And so if we are writing about people who are affected by COVID in Tanzania, and that reporting is completely disconnected from Tanzanians and what they want to see out of our journalism and the kind of narratives they think are important to be telling, then we're not doing our job right either. And so we're kind of going on our own journey, just like the aid sector is, around what does it mean to ensure that we are sharing the power and privilege that we have as journalists, and technically as gatekeepers, really, with the people that our journalism is meant to serve? And how do we ensure that they are part of shaping those narratives, are part of, that we have a finger on the pulse of what they want and need out of our journalism? And that's a whole big challenge, similar to, I think, it feels as daunting as some of the changes in the aid sector do it, because it completely transforms the way journalism tends to be done, but a very exciting and important transformation, I think.
So Arbie and then perhaps Degan, just building on that, the conversation around anti-racism has quite rightly forced many to consider their own either conscious or unconscious complicity in the perpetuation of what we've got. And that is sort of, I think it's a healthy discussion, but a very uncomfortable discussion. But how do we bring, as Heba says, people on the journey so that we don't, this isn't a process about alienating, it's about carving out a much better future based on genuine solidarity. How do you do that? Because, I think there are many people, and probably many in the audience here, who've worked in aid with good intentions, wanting to help, and are feeling deeply challenged by this. And, we need to challenge ourselves, but that, that's a very discomforting place.
Yeah, sure. I can go first and then maybe they can follow. Yeah, so I think at an organizational level, as I said earlier in my sort of like talk, I refuse to believe that it's about sort of like problematic collection of problematic people, or like a mass of problematic people. And don't get me wrong, there are problematic people. There is white supremacy. There are white supremacists, in the aid sector. But, I'd like to look at the system, right? And how I like to juxtapose it, I was working with this one organization, and I juxtapose it as, because of the pressures that we feel in the aid sector, we tend to, as organizations, make a trade-off between excellence and ethics. So the excellence is all about, creating bureaucracies and more growth and more income and more technical standards and all these compliance. And I think we trade off growth for that. And I think that's, a bigger conversation about how to be sort of like more ethical. And then when we do that trade-off, then it becomes dominance, especially when those doing the trade-off are white faces in northern organizations. Then it's experienced as dominance that is racist or colonial. And then in terms of the pressure, I think that is the key problem, right? The pressure is coming from external forces like donors and donor publics. And I think the pressure needs to, we need to solve that pressure. And we can only do so in a limited way internally. If I can summarize what I think could help alleviate this pressure, is that the new Humanitarian should be better than the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is this magazine in the UK, which is very right-wing and, sells like really problematic myths about Africa or Asia and about aid sector. And that shapes the thinking of the donor publics, which then policymakers in places like the UK and the US listen to. And that's how they respond. So then how can we kind of like holistically change that sort of like popular public image so that then the policymakers will respond to that, which will then ease the pressure in our own organizations, in our own sector. So that's, yeah.
Thank you, Arbie. So Degan, the Daily Mail is very popular. I think it's fair to say, sadly. But equally, you've been a very vocal critic, Degan, of inappropriate use of marketing by INGOs, what you would label poverty porn. But that poverty porn, whatever it's associated with, often translates into dollars, which are being valued and used for the growth of the system and INGOs. So what would you say in response to that? How do you bring well-intentioned people on the journey without them becoming complicit in the perpetuation of what we want to challenge?
I think I like how Arbie put it as a dichotomy between excellence and ethics. I think if we really place ethics at the heart of what we do, then it shouldn't even be an issue to discuss poverty porn. It shouldn't be even an issue to discuss child sponsorship. These should not even be controversial issues. and it should be seen as what they are. But I think the problem is that people are so rooted to these things because it's about generating income and keeping their business model going. And when you touch the money, you touch the heart of the issue. That's really what it comes down to. You know, money is the engine that moves the whole sector. Everything is about money. It's about growth. As a CEO, your growth model, as a board, you're rewarded for growth. You're not rewarded for downsizing. And now if you say to these organizations, completely stop all images of children and women, Black and brown bodies that are used to raise money and this whole idea of child sponsorship, then they will be like, we really like what you say, but we can't do that because that's really touching on the heart of their success. So I think it's really a choice that they have to make. It's a hard choice, but I think once they make those choices, that will be a pivotal turning point to getting that vision that Heba talked about. Becoming real. Because if they make a choice to value ethics and do the right thing and be anti-racist and decolonize their institutions over money, then I think they will be making the right choices and we will be seeing a mass transformation of organizations in the system. One thing I would like to add to what Arbie's point about white supremacy. There's a gentleman named Daryl Davis. He's a Black American and he's in the US and he's very well known for converting KKK members and going to KKK meetings to convert them and make them anti-racist. I bring up this point because there are people who believe that white supremacists should not be communicated with, they should be exiled, they should be doxxed, they should be all of this. I'm not one of those people. I believe that there is humanity in everybody and we need to be humble and be willing to have a conversation and a dialogue with everybody, no matter what their views are. And I do have hope that most people, even some who say some crazy, evil things to me personally, have said things to me, I believe that there is an opportunity to have a conversation with those people and hopefully change their minds. So I think we have to practice that model of humility and not othering people, even those people that we don't agree with who are saying some evil things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I jump in, Peter? Because I think we do need to accept that you're not going to be able to bring everyone along. Some people are just not going to come on the journey. So what you're trying to do is there's a kind of critical mass in the middle that could go either way, and those are the ones you want to bring. And I think a lot of the challenge is in the framing. If you tell international NGOs, you are the problem, get out of the way, and leave the space for the others, you're completely excluding them from the picture. If you tell NGOs, your role could change and here's how it can change in a way that can be beneficial to this kind of journey that we want to go on, you're still providing a space in which they can be part of the solution. So I think it's figuring out how can you be inclusive in the change process and figure out ways of leveraging the value add that each player will bring, recognizing that some people will simply end up losing their power and they're not going to like that. And that is going to be ugly and confrontational. And that's just part of a change process. And so I think there's a bit of a two-pronged approach. One is how do you make the change as inclusive as possible, but then accepting that somebody's inevitably going to kind of lose out on any power shift. And that's a reality that we shouldn't be denying.
Thank you for that. I think with many of you, I've discussed, well, in fact, we've all discussed that there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't a panacea that's actually going to make this shift. And, you know, I completely overused the term incremental radicalism, you know, as you all know. But I think we need to find examples which start to build up momentum, because we do run the risk of, you know, the unintended consequences of trying to do the right thing, but then just creating a void where others go in and continue to do what's always been done. So I think there's something fundamental around, you know, how do we just have a snowball effect around the type of change that we're seeking that gathers momentum. And I think there's absolutely something about the complementarity that needs to exist between local and international, local as possible, as international as necessary, but where the power sits in that dynamic. So I have a question for you, Dani. In your opening address, you had a really beautiful quote, which I'll probably misquote now, but it was from an Aboriginal activist. And I think it was, if you have come to help, you're wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then we can work together. I've probably done it a complete disservice, but I love the intent around that, because for me, that spoke about sort of partnership, complementarity, and so forth. And you then went on to talk about mutuality and solidarity. Given that we want a locally led but globally connected world, given our transboundary issues, how do you approach this, given the history of power imbalance?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think that was it's a quote from an amazing individual, Dr. Lilla Watson. And it applies in so many ways, but I think particularly to our sector at this moment. And, you know, you asked earlier, Peter, about, you know, what can we do? You know, there's no silver bullet, but I think that, you know, if you're interested enough in these issues to be part of this conference, then I think you have a particular responsibility, particular opportunity, because I think each of us has a responsibility and opportunity to change this. And you know, if you take this notion of mutuality and say, well, you know, that's what humanitarianism has always been about, but we somehow have built institution structures and bureaucracy that sort of sapped it out of us and built some sort of edifice of something else, then each of us in every way, in every sort of conversation, transaction, interaction, should be asking, what more can we do to change this from sort of traditional charity-based, paternalistic, perhaps neo-colonial sort of interventions to something that's different. And I think, you know, we've just been talking about, you know, how we collect money or how we raise money. You know, in our experience here at Oxfam GB, we've just made some big changes in our own internal division. We've got a new engagement division that's going to try to take this on, saying we have to raise money, especially in a country where the government is, you know, shamefully cutting aid at the moment of a huge humanitarian crisis. We have a responsibility to inspire supporters in that notion of solidarity, but we've got to sort of lean into this and speak to, you know, when we do our audience polling, yes, some of our older traditional supporters believe in a notion of sort of compassion or humanitarianism, but many of our younger supporters are inspired by equality and justice, and that's why they come to organizations like us. So I think we have to, you know, even in those sort of, if you're a fundraiser listening to this, ask yourself, how do you put mutuality at the center of what you do? I think if we talk about, you know, race within our sector or racism within our sector, you know, we should be calling out, challenging, but also accompanying each other to make sure that every interaction we have with each other as professionals, as partners, as colleagues, we should also be anti-racist and challenging some of those, you know, sadly, racist behaviors, microaggressions that I still see day to day in my working life. And I think it becomes particularly important when those of us who are working in the system interact with, you know, local partners, quote unquote, which is, you know, and to sort of challenge ourselves to make sure that every aspect of that relationship is, you know, is based on mutuality and respect and not on some sort of paternalistic or neo-colonial model. And I think if we start to change each of those behaviors, each of those interactions at every point, you know, then I think we will give ourselves the best chance of getting that sort of transformation that we're all desperate for in our sector. And so maybe, Peter, it's not that we have one silver bullet, but I don't know how many hundreds of people are on the call, but we have hundreds of silver bullets waiting to be deployed in this project.
I'll show my age. I think, as Billy Bragg said, the revolution is just a t-shirt away. So anyway, let's move on now to donors. There's a number of questions coming through around donors, and there is that old expression, you know, he or she who pays the piper calls the tune. So maybe if I can go back to you, Degan, you were a key driver at the World Humanitarian Summit around grand bargain and localization. Donors laid out many pledges, commitments, but in the 5 or so years since, I think many would argue that many donors describe that as buyer's remorse. And we still, even though localization or locally led is fundamentally about power, even if you look at the funding flows, only 3% of humanitarian aid is getting directly through to local organizations. The majority of funds raised in this sector are absorbed or spent within the global north and its architecture. So a number of questions are coming in around, how do you influence Western governments into the new vision of humanitarianism? How do you really influence them? Are they really going to ever change their risk appetite, which is often a fundamental barrier to making the types of shifts that we have? And are INGOs and INGO leaders really willing to bite the hand that feeds? Because there's the disproportionate, often unhealthy reliance on the donors that are providing a lot of the resources.
Yeah, I mean, I keep saying this, but I do think that money is at the heart of this change process, and it's very difficult to relinquish power without ceding market and market share, and that means ceding money. I think changing the donors is like a three-pronged approach. I think there has to be a changing of the mindset of the people in the countries, the taxpayers, because that's their biggest excuse. They always say we have to be accountable to our taxpayers, and therefore local organizations are more risky, and we have to work with our national institutions who are less risky. Okay, so let's change the narrative about civil society, about mutuality and partnership and solidarity and what that means. And I think we really need to have a different kind of media narrative. We've seen how important it was to have the mainstream media in the US and even across the Western world be an ally of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how the entire media has been supporting that movement. So, and that has changed the mindset of many people who were not even very political. They were just, people sitting in homes doing their 9-to-5 jobs, not really interested in political activism, that have engaged because of that media. So media is extremely powerful. Second, how do we influence that media? I think this is where global North civil society, I keep talking about solidarity. We can't go to the UK and influence the Daily Mail, but Oxfam GB can. Christian Aid UK can. All of these INGOs in the UK can do that if they're working in real solidarity with us. So not only influencing your public, but influencing your media and how they tell the story of change, and then putting that pressure on the donors. Third thing is, it's also about institutional accountability. If you say, I'm not willing to play the game anymore, and you exit the space, yes, you might cede that market share for someone who says, I'm willing to play the game. And that has been some of the fears echoed by some INGO CEOs I've worked with. They say, oh, if we stop using poverty porn, if we stop doing this, and then another INGO comes into and that's really important, but let's have some courageous actors who say enough is enough. DFID, unless you do X, Y, and Z, or if FCDO, we're not going to partner with you anymore. It's not about us being beggars and waiting for them to give us money, but us making deliberate choices as civil society saying, we have put you as FCDO on a blacklist for us because you just are not behaving in an ethical way. You're not practicing what you preach. You have failed on the grand bargain commitments. You have failed on this and you have failed on that. So holding them accountable in a way, but that means you as an organization, as a CEO, as the board have to be ready for the financial consequences of those decisions, which means you have to have other alternative means of funding, which they do. They have huge amounts of public support. They have foundation support. They have all of these things. We don't have that in the global South. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach that has to be implemented to change donors' perspective. But I do think there's a coalition of INGOs who need to have the courage to do the right thing and start that domino to fall slowly but surely.
Peter, I feel like you've been asking us about this kind of forcing function this whole time. And I feel like we're kind of all of us referring to three pillars of what it takes to force that change. The external environment, and here we're talking about how COVID is changing the finance landscape, how Black Lives Matter is putting reputational risk for organizations that don't come along, et cetera. So I think there are external drivers, and when I talked about those kind of limits the sector is facing, those are driving agents of change in a way. Then there's the consensus building, and that's the point that Degan's making around the role of the media. And if you think about something like cash, right? Which a few years ago was still quite peripheral and now is pretty central to the way the sector operates. How did that change happen? It was consensus building over time in building the evidence base and kind of bringing people along on an intellectual journey. And then there's the question of leadership and people who are courageous enough to go out and really push for this at a hard level. So I think between the external drivers, the consensus building, and the leadership, we're already seeing a lot of evidence that on each of those fronts, there's a bit of movement. And for me, it's just a question of how fast that then happens.
So Dajani, you've got your mic off. Do you want to?
I was going to jump in with my three, please, but I can't believe I'm saying this because I want to support all that stuff about politics, but there are also having done this job for the last couple of years, maybe three sort of bureaucratic things we can do, particularly to change donor behaviors. One's the sort of data, that slide that Heba put up earlier about calling out how ludicrous a system we have built, including through donor behavior, through showing the evidence is going to be incredibly important. We've done some internal analysis within the Oxfam Confederation about how we're spending our own unrestricted resources, the geography of that spend. And it's not a pretty picture. And it's the first step to sort of accountability by saying, here is how it actually is being spent and pointing out that. I think the second is this something around, I don't know how many accountants are listening to this call, but something around reframing what value for money means. Because if your donors consistently expect from you to deliver value for money only with a short-term lens, get this stuff out the door or get this done, you're never going to capture issues like long-term resilience. And I think we need to, contest what value for money really means. And thirdly, a colleague of mine, our head of integrity and ethics, says we need to decolonize compliance. And we can't do that by assuming that compliance is going to go away because, I donate to charities. I expect my money will be spent wisely. And I have, we can't sort of wish it away, but we can fundamentally change the way, the sort of almost complacent, sometimes lazy way in which we accept the sort of compliance rules that donors set us. And I think those are, I hope, sort of three bureaucratic things to go with Heba and Degan's far more interesting political things, but we can also get on with.
Well, we forget that this change is in donors' interests anyway. And so they're like looking for the way in which they can, yes, at times they are the blockage, but it's also kind of ripe territory where if we can make it easy for them, this stuff is going to save them money. So why would they go against it? So it's just a matter of kind of matching up those incentives with I think you're right, Dajani, with the kind of, here's how procedurally we can actually do it.
I jump in on that. I'm sorry, I know we have like 2 minutes before to segue, but I just want to tie those things together too, because there is an element where this is in the best interest of the donors, but there's this self-perpetuating mythical cycle that is self-reinforcing of the institutions that have been put in place since like the 1930s and 40s. And you've got this massive UN system, and you've got this massive corporatized NGO system. And there's this theory and this idea about compliance, and there's this idea, it's sort of risk appetite. We have to build capacity, but no one ever really defines what that is, who defines capacity. And I think Arbie's point earlier about, in his actual keynote, about let's talk about failure because it happens, and let's not lie about it, and let's not sugarcoat it. And it's sort of creating an appetite among the public that yes, we want accountability where our unrestricted dollars go, but you're working in a war zone. Of course, sometimes things go bad. Of course, sometimes things don't act in the way they do. And this idea of, all of these different things together, but I question sometimes where we need to target our interests. And I talked in my kind of opening remarks about the global groundswell, and I'll talk about it again when we wrap up tonight. Everyone on this call, as Dajani said, everyone who's attended this conference, everybody put money forward for a ticket. Like, we didn't give tickets away for free on purpose. I wanted people to be invested in this conversation and be present for the conversation. So guess what? Talk about leadership. Anyone who's attended this conference, don't wait for the movement to happen. We have to actually, if something inspired you, if you're an accountant that just heard Dajani say that, like, hey, guess what? I'm not an economist. I can't do that data. So raise your hand and help us with that data. It's all of us on this call.
So I think that's a good way. We spoke about, and I'm going to give myself a little plug again, incremental radicalism. I think we've got many, many different threads here that could conflate, could work together. And I think it's there's an opportunity for us all to seize. I would like to, we have got a couple of other things we need to get through this evening, but firstly, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for a really provoking conversation. I think I've thoroughly enjoyed it, even if I've been tempted to keep jumping in. But thank you so much, really appreciate it, and I hope the audience liked it, and apologies to the audience for many of the questions that I wasn't able to get to in the time limit. I just want to finish with a quote, if I may, before we move on to the next section, which I hope sums up both our challenge and our opportunity here. It's by the writer George Monbiot, who many of you will know from The Guardian, and his book Out of the Wreckage. And he said, "The old world, which once looked stable, even immutable, is collapsing. A new era has begun, loaded with hazard if we fail to respond, charged with promise if we seize the moment. Whether the systems that emerge from this rupture are better or worse than the current dispensation depends on our ability to tell a new story, a story that learns from the past, places us in the present, and guides us into the future." And to build on your comments, Mariana, I think it's up to all of us as part of this system, as flawed as we may think it is, to actually push in a new direction. So we have a couple of additional items before we close, and our next item is pop-up poetry. And our next guest is Dana Dajani. Dana is an award-winning Palestinian writer, performer, and advocate. She lives and works between the Middle East and Europe, with bases in both Amman and London. Her work as an actress, trainer, and consultant has taken her around the world, from performing at the Sydney Opera House and the Guggenheim Museum to creating drama therapy program for children with autism in UAE, where she was honoured as Emirates Woman Artist of the Year and received the Young Arab Award for Entertainment, along with other recognitions. She's known for her original spoken word poetry and has a background in theatre that has informed and influenced her writing. I am personally so excited to hear Dana sum up what she has heard tonight. So over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Peter, for introducing me. Thank you so much to all of the panelists and everyone in the conference who presented. I know that I will leave you inspired and with a sense of hope and power. As Peter mentioned, I do spoken word poetry, and I tend to focus on social justice themes. And thanks to an introduction from Heba to Liz, I've been here the last 2 days, and I've been witnessing and recording poetic reflections, and I want to just dive straight into them. They're unfiltered, and I just want to reiterate that this is all recorded from what was heard in the conference. Here we go. So who are the humanitarians? I believe they are here. And what do they know? That even in our confined spaces, we can still connect, grow, be here for each other. So those who stood out, stepped up, showed up to serve the greater global community, those who showed up to receive and engage and participate, those who organized and programmed within this conference and throughout their careers, thank you. You've inspired me here, and I'm sure many others over the years. You are paving the way. And you will leave this conference today with stories, many stories. Share them, spread them. Don't be diplomatic. Tell these stories from the heart. Hit the hammer on the nail. Don't beat about the bush, just start. Say it as it is. Focus on what needs care. Be real, raw. People are suffering here. What can we do to help? Be a mediator, not a rescuer. Share stories of resilience, not images of destruction. Pay respect to leaders, future, past, and current. Preserve and share indigenous knowledge. Passed down through oral tradition over generations of living in close contact with nature. Specific to local environments, it will improve living conditions there. Indigenous knowledge is no oxymoron, informal, alternative, ancient, inapplicable. Quite the opposite. It is dynamic, emergent. It is the ongoing process of learning to adapt new ways and innovative solutions to current issues based on data we have collected through our lived experiences. Ubuntu, collaborative, collective, working mindset, improvisational and inclusive, to challenge development, transform it. Keep in mind, those with the problems are usually a few steps ahead in identifying solutions, so let go of quick fixes, let go of orders given, top down. The voices to lead us are present on the ground. They understand the landscapes of their issues. We honor their intelligence, their dignity, their agency and wisdom, and pledge to support them by providing the assistance desired to implement their own solutions. Because those indigenous are not separate from the rest of us. We are all indigenous to this third planet from the sun. We're all local to somewhere, even in the globalization era. So what do you bring to the pot of collective wisdom? Innovate has been a buzzword I'm sure that we're all sick of, but what of the hubris of that potential aim? Yes, we're all problem solvers, but let's not give in to a cliche. I ask you to consider humanitarians, to take some time to ask, understand, what is the intelligent already present in the space, the context? Can you tune in? That is ethical listening. And can you value the courage and sometimes the price of speaking up? We do what we can to force the space that wasn't there naturally, to create interactions that are deliberate and meaningful, intentional inclusion of speakers and listeners, stakeholders and donors, dissidents and proponents. Starting at the bottom and responding to the needs of the people isn't such a unique concept, but it will define success. It will create an environment centered on solutions, an open, free space, huge optimism. Someone hears us, hey, endless possibilities and outcomes, and eventually change. Can we humanitarians recognize our privilege, make a personal commitment to listen from the heart with all of our presence, not letting language be a barrier, listening beyond words to energy, emotion, personality, disruptive and unquiet, sure to also make space for the people in the room who don't naturally jump to take the stage. Trust that everyone has something wise to say. Engage in a meaningful way. Listen to, care. There are so many willing to share their stories. Who are the humanitarians? You might recognize yourself among this crew. Are you the rabbit who works to prevent food scarcity? The tortoise who works for peace? The hare who protects and keeps safe? The parrot with her intelligence? The nightingale who alleviates suffering with song and ceremony? Or perhaps the eagle who negotiates and mediates agreements? Ours is the story of global justice. We who believe in the power of the individual to influence an institution, influence a single life, influence the world for the better. We stand together with others as a collective when meeting with threats, emergencies, when meeting our goals. The humanitarians have a willingness to carry a heavy load, share the cost and burdens of taking care of those in need, with a commitment to protecting the vulnerable, domestically and internationally. The humanitarians see in all people the potential for vulnerability. This links us together, the source of our sameness. We know that we're all capable of coming into harm's way, and this is the source of our empathy. It drives our power we express solidarity with the stigmatized. We seek to listen, set our judgments, biases, and preconceived ideas aside to understand another point of view. And this allows us to identify and feel with all vulnerable groups. A moral imagination helps us to set aside the analytic and theoretical and use our creative thinking and patience to listen, cultivating compassion and empathy. Could you walk a mile along someone else as they wear their own shoes on their own journey? This is what it is to choose solidarity. beyond a feeling, action rooted in responsibility, an invitation to use our moral imagination to engage with a capable collective and build towards the same goal. So we equip ourselves, protect our spirits. We create a map of our vision. A map in hand is a key to come back to regularly. Perhaps it grows with us organically to represent the experiences that we're living. We will decolonize the humanitarian ecosystem by paving the way for all people to actively participate in deciding our children and grandchildren's fate. The humanitarians are resilient. We lead in crisis, humble pilots. A humanitarian is a catalyst, not a savior complex, led by humility, curiosity, impartiality. We respect everyone's inherent dignity. Led by our values, we set boundaries. We don't compromise ideals to meet a donor's expectation or trade excellence for ethics. We say no to what doesn't align with our mission, and we support each other through the process of development. What are the principles of our partnership? Shared humanity, equality, solidarity. I think I've gone over time. Maybe this is a good pausing point.
Dana, that was just truly incredible. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure if you could see the audience, there'd be a huge amount of applause for those incredible words. We are very close to time, so I'd just like to once again thank the panel and now hand over to Mariana for some closing remarks. Thanks, Mariana.
So I don't know where to begin. Following Dana, I knew would be a really big challenge. I don't know if anyone else needs a tissue, but I've got some handy. What a great way to summarize our work of the last 2 days. And I can't think of a better way to transition into our final moments. I have to say that I had about 8 minutes of remarks prepared. I'm going to try to get through these as fast as possible. I'm also aware that we have some non-native English speakers on our call, so I'm trying to speak slowly, but also trying to squeeze in our last few comments. Before I start with my final thoughts, my 3 points, I want to pause and express appreciation and gratitude. Words at this moment really don't feel like enough. But I would like to again acknowledge our conference sponsors and partners. CHL exists because of a partnership between Degan University and Save the Children Australia. Thank you to both organizations for championing CHL's quite radical vision to lead and influence change within the humanitarian system. Thank you again to our key conference sponsors, including Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the IKEA Foundation, and the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. I had a plan to mention all of our keynotes and their organizations, but I think they'll forgive me in the interest of time. You met most of them many times during the last 2 days. Thank you so much to you and your organizations for being present and offering your brilliance to shape the conversation. Thank you to our plenary and session chairs. I won't list everyone, there's too many to list, but thank you also to if you're a moderator, speaker, panelist, and everyone who presented an abstract, asked a brave question, or otherwise engaged courageously with the topics at hand. Thank you to the poets and to the musicians who tickled our ears, our hearts, and our minds, and please post those publicly because we all need them to read again. Thank you to the 188 individuals who contributed extra funds on top of their own admission tickets to sponsor scholarships for people who had financial need during these really difficult months. Your generosity provided free admission for a total of 78 people. That's a really great step in developing new forms of solidarity, I think, to make sure everyone can be at the table. Lastly, for the thanks, I'd like to thank and acknowledge our events manager and rockstar superstar, Liz Thompson. Liz was the source of all of the really brilliant ideas that elevated this gathering to another level. She's like an invisible blanket that kept everything together in the background. And with her excellent leadership and vision, we've had a really special gathering. Thank you also to Deacon's commercial events team, who were nothing short of extraordinary. And to the CHL team, you've all contributed on a crazy adventure. You can all take the day off tomorrow if you're still on the call. You've definitely earned it. We'll take a time to celebrate next week. I'm so proud to lead this team, and I'm so proud that you have all chosen to be courageous and humble every single day, and that you don't laugh when I have a crazy idea like having a digital conference for like 1,000 people. And to our esteemed guests, I promise we're wrapping up with the last final comments. On the first day, I asked you all to reflect on a single question. What is the main problem we face in this system? And what's the problem that we're trying to address? We gathered in this virtual space with purpose. We each paid a price in time, energy, money, and wholehearted engagement in a very distracted Zoom world to sit with complicated and often uncomfortable truths. We made a collective commitment that this conference would move us from rhetoric to action. So what's next? You just heard some great ideas on the panel. Degan presented her rousing 4-point call to action yesterday. Dajani then reflected on concepts of paternalism, power dynamics, mutual solidarity, and a new humanitarianism for a new era. Lina Abirafi challenged us to consider a paradigm shift that can be offered by feminist leadership. Arbie gave us 4 brilliant ideas, including the idea of trembling in our ignorance and taking joy in the pluriverse, which I loved. Lina Sergi Attar called us to redefine and reclaim our language and wondered if neutrality stands against our humanity. And now Heba, of course, has tied it all together to highlight the limits of the current system, and she's proposed that we start imagining. The work cannot stop here. This conference is not the work. I'll propose a couple of additional steps. Number 1, continue the deep personal journey of understanding how we are all complicit in an unjust system that creates and perpetuates imbalances of power. Good intentions, as Degan said yesterday, are not enough. We are all members of this global groundswell I spoke of in the opening session. The reckoning is coming, but how will we lead? How will you personally contribute? Number 2, both Dani and Degan, and now the rest of us, have called for a redefinition of solidarity and the concept of mutual liberation. Who will lead a new movement of activism and solidarity to challenge global institutions like Bretton Woods, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and potentially the UN Security Council itself, which has been broken by great power politics for decades? Can INGOs reimagine themselves for this era? True solidarity, genuine accountability, and protection that reaches into the halls of power holders? Can we use our power and our privilege and our collection of voices to demand safeguarding for all populations? Can we use this collective power to demand vaccine and health equity? Can we demand that the aid architecture itself is decolonized? Yes, I know it's a lot of overwhelming big ideas, but we can't ignore the roots of the problem and expect the system to resolve itself. As Heba reminded us, our roots started in social activism. Can we find our way back? Number 3, begin now to colonize our language and lexicon. Efforts are underway to secure commitments from a lot of large INGOs to ban the use of harmful terminology. Stay tuned for announcements about this. Many of you have already reached out in the past 2 days to ask if CHL can harness multiple streams of effort in this space and provide some leadership. Humbly and publicly, as CHL director, I commit that we will devote resources, time, money, whatever we need to do to make sure we don't lose momentum on this front. If you're interested to be a part of this, please reach out. Number 4, and the last one, commit to further participation in the next 12 months to maintain momentum on topics that were raised in the last 2 days. Following the conference, keep an eye out for opportunities to provide feedback, join additional virtual workshops on critical topics, and commit to engage and attend these events. Don't wait for someone else to lead if a topic moved you. CHL, Adeso, and others will continue a series of virtual workshops and retreats to maintain pressure and momentum to do what we can. But use your spheres of influence. If you're an academic, a CEO, a UN employee, a board member, a journalist, keep the conversations alive. And finally, go with humility and courage. To use Arbie's words, let's tremble in our ignorance. Let's imagine a new role for international aid. Let's get back to the pulsing heart, to use Danny's words. This will not be easy, but it will be worth it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone for this evening's or today's panel. Thanks everyone, that's the end of the session. I wish you all the very best for the rest of the day.